So we have this episode of the golden calf in chapter 32. Now, for anyone who is conversant with the rest of the Bible, this reminds us of another passage that comes up later in the book of Kings. And this is after the death of King Solomon. We're told that Jeroboam, who had been in charge of the forced labor and had led a revolt against Solomon and had to go down to Egypt and all sorts of resonance of the Exodus there. And when he comes back, he leads a secession and breaks off the northern kingdom from the kingdom of Judah. And in the course of that, he sets up two sanctuaries, two temples, one in Dan, way up on the Lebanese border, and one in Bethel, which was just a stone's throw from Jerusalem, you might say.
That's right.
So at the two ends to nail the thing down. But then we are told that he set up two calves of gold and said to the people, "You've been going up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel." Now, the Hebrew word there, Elohim, can be really either singular or plural.
Yeah.
But if you're setting up two calves, I suppose it's reasonable to take it in the plural.
Especially as the verse goes on, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and the verb to bring out there is in the plural.
In the plural.
So
well,
certainly,
it grammatically agrees.
The context certainly suggests the plural there. The way this resonates, of course, with the golden calf story is this is exact words that Aaron says to the people when he makes the golden calf at the foot of Sinai, right? "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt."
Now, if we press the question, which of these is likely to have come first? If you're reading the Bible in sequence, well, Aaron did this back in the time of Exodus. Jeroboam should have known better.
Right.
But in all probability, one
reverse.
suspects that it's quite the reverse, and that Jeroboam did this, and this is being read back into the Exodus story to condemn Jeroboam.
Right. I mean, to say that Jeroboam's calves are equivalent to the first great Israelite sin, right? That first moment where they really messed up, which, to be fair, Jeroboam, this is his first moment, right? He's just started. I mean, you see what he's trying to do. Jeroboam has a people who have been used to, over a couple of generations, going to Jerusalem to sacrifice at that one central sanctuary where the ark is. And so he says, right, enough with that. Why should Jerusalem get all the pilgrims? My people should be sacrificing in my kingdom. And he builds these two calves.
Now, is that so bad to set up calves?
It depends who you ask.
Yes.
I mean,
in the Decalogue, they say, "You shall not have strange gods before me, and you shall not make for yourself a graven image." Were these images of the God, do you think?
I think that these are images of Yahweh. I think that's the part that most people, that has been most misunderstood about the story, is that it's not a story of idolatry proper, where the people are worshiping a different God.
Right.
They say, these are the gods who brought you out of Egypt. They're not confused about who that was.
So how do you take the plural? Is it Yahweh and somebody else, or are they both Yahweh?
They're both Yahweh.
Yeah.
And we know, actually, that in ancient Israel and elsewhere in the Near East, the idea of local manifestations of a deity is a regular thing. We have inscriptions that talk about the Yahweh of Samaria, the Yahweh of Teman. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for Jeroboam to at least have said, "These are your gods," right? Now, this is your God, and this is your God, and they're both Yahweh.
But how would it have been shocking to people to have an image? And is the image supposed to be the God? Now, in Mesopotamia, you have the care and feeding of the images, as if the image were the God. Even there, though, surely they didn't think the image actually was the God.
I'm not going to speak to what Mesopotamians thought. I do think, no, I don't think they thought it was the God. I think God, what God says is don't make any images of me. Right? That's not the same thing as don't make any me. right? I think it's fair to say this is representative, but that is the law. And actually what's, I think, crucial to recognize is if we recognize that the calves are images of Yahweh, then the people's sin is not their violation of the first of the 10 commandments. The first of the 10 commandments says, you will have no other gods beside me. Well, this isn't that. This is the same God.
Yeah,
What they're violating is not the first of the 10 commandments. It's the first law of the covenant code. The very first words of the laws at the end of Exodus 20, which say, right, you saw that when I spoke to you, you didn't see anything. Therefore, make no image of me. Right, so that's the law that they're violating here.
Now, in the temple in Jerusalem, without getting into speculating as to whether there was a cult image there, it's quite openly admitted that you had the cherubim.
Yeah.
Now, these were some kind of images, and then they refer to Yahweh as the one who is enthroned above the cherubim.
That's right.
Now, one of my teachers in graduate school used to maintain that perhaps Yahweh was standing on the bull or enthroned above the bull.
It's possible. It's certainly possible that it was something like a throne or a base for an imagined but invisible deity. Certainly, that's the case of what's going on in the temple, right? Where it says explicitly, as you say, right, the cherubs, right, which are lions with wings, not babies with wings. The cherubs are God sits on them. So it's certainly possible that the calf is sort of a base. At the same time, in Canaanite religion, the calf was the paradigmatic image of the god Baal.
It's the bull Ale.
The bull is Ale, and the calf is Baal. And as much as the Bible tries to distance Yahweh and Israel's God from Ale and Baal, we know from plenty of places and examples that, in fact, right, we had a lot of syncretism, right, of the ideas of the various gods get mushed together, and they're very much more fluid than we would think otherwise.
Yeah.
A bull representing Yahweh is not, or a calf is not surprising in that sense.
But all Jeroboam was trying to do, in any case, presumably, is to make the presence of the God available to the people.
I think it's a purely economic move.
And but even theologically, I think in any cult, you have to have some way where people can feel that they're coming in contact with the God, maybe not necessarily touch it, but have a way to focus the attention.
It's the bulls in Dan and Bethel, and it's the ark in Jerusalem.
And how early do you think this commandment not to make a likeness of the God would have taken hold?
It's hard to know. We don't have it, in part because of where the Bible comes from, right? Who wrote it, right? The people who wrote it were particularly literate, elite, a very small subset of the population. We don't have too much examples of images of the deity referred to, of the deity proper referred to, in any positive sense. Right? The aniconic tradition is actually relatively consistent and strong, I think, in the biblical text itself. That said, outside of the world, the restricted world of the authors of the Bible, it was nothing but icons all the time.
And of course, there were all sorts of laws that you have that don't seem to have had any effect on the lives of the people.
Archaeology has well demonstrated that the sort of aniconic tradition of you will have no image of the deity reached about as far as the end of the scroll.
And but that doesn't mean it wasn't there.
Oh, right.
Yeah. It could have been there from an early point. Now, if I understand you correctly, you would take all of chapter 32 as the Elohist?
That's right.
So now the Elohist is usually thought to have come from the northern kingdom, and in this case it would be very critical of a major part of the program of the northern kingdom. So would you want to expand from that, that this is generally a kind of a critical source, maybe in the vein of some of the prophets.
Right. So, I mean, the prophets are the best example here.
Yeah.
We know that prophets were often in the employ of the kings. I mean, Isaiah seems to have been, a royal advisor.
Yeah.
Isaiah is critical of, that's their job, right? The job of the prophets seems to be sort of like a professional adversary, whether they are actually in the employ of the monarchy or not. The Elohist source is this very strongly prophetic tradition. Right? As I said, this is the source that thinks about the Sinai event as the moment when Moses is authorized as prophet. So, that prophetic critical strand, even within the northern kingdom of the northern kingdom, it looks very much like Hosea.
So this was not royal propaganda. This was not like the state's myth or the
No, I think it's much easier to see J being like that for the southern. But the northern, prophets were very rarely mouthpieces for the monarchy.
Okay,
very rarely.
Now, the thing that puzzles me, and this is still in a more or less historical vein about this story, is that it's Aaron who has to go make the statue. Now, Aaron the Aaronate priesthood is associated with Jerusalem. Why do they incriminate him? Do they just want to forestall the idea that they would be taken as propaganda for the southern kingdom?
This is, I have to simply admit, this is one of the great mysteries of this story to me, is why Aaron is on the one hand blamed, and then almost immediately thereafter let off the hook, right? So that when Moses comes down the mountain and says to Aaron, "What are you doing?" And Aaron says, "Threw some gold into the fire and out came a calf." Right? First of all, he's lying because the narrative said something different. But Moses' response seems to be, "Okay, that's fine," right? Which makes no sense. So the critique, but then the backing off of the critique. It's a puzzling moment. I have to admit.
Let's, though, before we conclude, there are two other points we want to touch on. One is the tablets get smashed.
They do.
Back years ago, when I was editing the Journal of Biblical Literature, this great Jewish scholar, Harry Erlinsky, who was quite old at the time, who sent in a note, and I asked him to revise some little bit in it. And he sent me back a cartoon of Moses coming down the mountain, smashing the tablets and saying, "Darn, another revision." Now, what happens with the revision?
Right, so
at the second, does God, you mentioned earlier, nobody ever repeats anything accurately in the Bible. Does God?
Well, maybe nobody's able to actually repeat anything verbally, but it's pretty clear from Exodus 34 that God says to Moses, right, "Make me another set of tablets, and I'm going to write on them exactly what was on the first set," which is to say, the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue. What's interesting is what's happened in chapter 34 is that story of the simple replacement of tablets has been conjoined with this actually very famous, wonderful moment where God reveals his sort of personality to Moses, right? He passes before him as Moses stands there in the mountain, and he proclaims, right, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, right? This God gracious and merciful, extending kindness to the 1000th generation. And so this moment of an expression of God's grace and mercy, which is not from that same story, this is from J, but it has been interwoven and combined deeply with this moment of covenant renewal, such that it ends up looking like what we have in Exodus 34 is not just a renewal of an old covenant, in fact, the making of a new one. The making of a new covenant on this basis of grace and mercy after the anger and the destruction of the tablets. This is an idea that I think had some resonance moving forward in Judeo-Christian tradition.
Oh, indeed it does. And new covenants will come into play later on. And more than one of them. But since you brought up this business of God being gracious and merciful, as we wrap up our discussion of the Exodus, are you impressed?
With the grace and the mercy of God? I think it's probably hard to take that too literally. This is a story that begins with God's people enslaved, has massive destruction of human and animal and environmental lives, the death of the firstborn, the destruction of the Egyptians at the sea. Even the story of the golden calf involves a bit where the Levites walk through the camp and they slay 3,000 of their fellow Israelites, which seems to be be met with great approval.
And even the passage itself here goes on punishing children and grandchildren to the third and fourth generation.
Right, this is that transgender, the sins of the father.
Yeah.
That's this.
This is not a sentimental God.
No.
But on the whole, you would agree that at least from somebody standing within the Israelite tradition, this is an upbeat book.
What I would say is, when you read this book, at the end of it, you'd think better to be part of the Israelites than any of the other guys. That's what I would say.
And mind you, that won't always be true as we work our way through the Old Testament.
Or beyond.
Or beyond.